Apple and Google have been competing since Android was first announced, with the late Steve Jobs even having been quoted saying that he was going to destroy Android. But over the last year or so, it really feels like Apple has been turning the heat up on this competition in what seems to be a concentrated effort on stealing Android users away from Google. And given the state of the industry, this makes perfect sense. Most people already have a smartphone, and they're upgrading those smartphones less often. So for a company like Apple, who obviously doesn't want to continue to see a dip in their sales figures, the gigantic market share that Android has over iOS presents itself as a huge opportunity. And the moves that Apple has been making to win Android users over has never been more obvious than in iOS 14, where they're not only doubling down on the relative strengths of like privacy and long-term support, but they introduced a number of new features that were pretty much copy and paste straight from Android. This has led to plenty of social media posts where Android fans are talking about how Android has had these features for years, but I think for Apple, that's exactly the point. On the one hand, they're giving every Android user one last reason not to switch to the iPhone, while on the other hand, even though Android users are technically making fun of the iPhone, they're simultaneously providing free advertising for the fact that some of their favorite Android features are making their way to the iPhone. But all of this didn't actually start with iOS 14. I think the first big move that Apple made, at least for me, was in iOS 13.1, when Apple finally brought real automation to the iPhone via Siri shortcuts. Now, before this update, automation on the iPhone was super limited, and it was just way better on Android. It was the main reason why I typically preferred Android phones over iPhones. But in iOS 13.1, Apple arguably evened the playing field. Of course, maybe that only matters to a small percentage of Android users like me. With iOS 14 though, Apple is going after the mainstream users. Whenever you hear someone talk about Android and why they like it, at some point or another, you're gonna hear the word customization. And while Android is still miles ahead in this area, iOS 14 does significantly narrow the gap by simply giving users the ability to add widgets right on their home screens, and by finally having a junk drawer for all those apps that don't need prominent placement, both things, by the way, that Android has had since day one. iOS 14 finally offers more control over the home screen, and I think it removes a major pain point that many Android users had when considering making the switch. But Apple didn't just stop at automation and customization. Another area where Android has always had the advantage over iOS is in multitasking. And again, while Android still has the edge in this area, iOS 14 has significantly narrowed the gap, with picture-in-picture finally letting iPhone users do things like watching a video while taking notes, or being on a video call while watching a video. Add to that the ability to now set default apps for email and browser, and all of a sudden, Android users that were on the fence about switching can be right at home on an iPhone by setting Gmail and Chrome as their default apps. And with the new backtap feature, the iPhone even gets better integration with the Google Assistant. Before, using the Google Assistant on the iPhone was a high friction process. You had to swipe out of the app that you're in and find the assistant wherever it was on your home screen. But now, you can set it where a simple double tap on the back of the iPhone launches the Google Assistant automatically, not just from the home screen, but in any app, even from the lock screen, which I think is a pretty big deal. I mean, we're talking about automation, customization, multitasking, default apps, and the tight integration with the Google Assistant. These were all features that pretty much 2 years ago were exclusive to Android, but with iOS 14, that's no longer the case. Now, I'm not saying that Android still isn't ahead in all of these areas, but Apple has again definitely narrowed the gap. And with them being more aggressive with pricing, with phones like the iPhone SE having the A13 Bionic chip, and with Apple supporting their phones with software updates for like 5 or 6 years compared to the 2 or 3 that you're lucky to get with most Android phones, honestly, I don't know if there's ever been a time where it's been easier for a lifetime Android user to make the switch. But what do you guys think? Do you think these new features are gonna get people to switch over to the iPhone more? Or do you think Android's advantages are just way too strong for that to happen? Let me know down below in the comments. Either way though, I think ultimately this is good for you and me, the consumer, since iOS is getting better, and as a result, Android's gonna get better too.